Hello and welcome. My name is Adam, and I'll be your quiet guide tonight. If you're here, maybe you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet your thoughts, letting the day slip away but not quite knowing how. I know that feeling well, because for a long time I struggled with insomnia too. The endless turning of thoughts, the heaviness in your chest when sleep just won't come. I used to wish for something, anything, to help my mind slow down, to soften the noise. That's why this story exists. It was created out of that same need, to offer something gentle to listen to, something peaceful to carry you toward rest. Tonight I'll take you through the history of the United States, but not the way you might remember from school. This isn't about memorizing names and dates. It's about drifting through time, calmly, softly, following the path of how a land became a nation and how that nation grew, stumbled, and changed. And if this quiet space brings you comfort, even just a little, I'd be grateful if you'd consider supporting the channel. Leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing really does help. It tells the algorithm that calm matters, and it helps this story reach someone else who might be lying awake tonight, just like you and me. So, thank you for being here. Let's begin. Before there were cities, before there were borders or flags, or even the idea of America, there was land. Ancient land, wild land, breathing, shifting, rich with life. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, the continent was home to civilizations that had thrived for thousands of years. People first migrated into North America at least 15,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, walking across a land bridge from Siberia to what is now Alaska. They followed the herds, watched the seasons, and slowly spread out, building lives across forests, deserts, mountains, and plains. And they built, they shaped, they remembered. In the Mississippi River Valley, the Mississippian culture raised great earthen mounds. Around the year 1050, they built a city called Cahokia, near today's St. Louis. At its center stood temples, plazas, and a solar calendar made of massive wooden poles, now known as Woodhenge. To the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved entire villages into the cliffs of Colorado. At Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, they built ceremonial spaces aligned with the movements of the stars, homes that still stand in quiet testimony to their precision and spiritual life. Along the Pacific coast, peoples like the Haida and Tlingit crafted longhouses from cedar, raised tall totem poles, and built societies rich in symbolism, storytelling, and trade. In the northeast forests, the Iroquois Confederacy brought together 6 powerful nations into a shared alliance, governed by councils and rules that would later influence ideas in the U.S. Constitution. Across the plains, the Lakota and Comanche lived in harmony with the land, nomadic, skilled, and deeply connected to nature. In the southeast, the Calusa created entire islands out of seashells and built a society shaped by waterways and coastlines. These were not scattered tribes, they were nations, with languages, governance, spiritual beliefs, and scientific understanding of the natural world. They studied the skies, passed down traditions, and honored the land through every season. This land was never empty. It was full of memory, full of presence. And though centuries of colonization would bring enormous change, loss, and pain, these original peoples remain. Their names echo in the rivers, in the mountains, and in the very words we still use, like Dakota, Ohio, Mississippi, and Chicago. And so we begin not with a flag or a revolution, but with presence, with the quiet, enduring truth that long before it was called America, this place was already home. After thousands of years of life on this continent, the world beyond the Atlantic began to stir. In the late 1400s, European powers were reaching outward, exploring, trading, and searching for new routes to wealth. What they found instead was a vast continent they hadn't known existed, a place filled not with empty land but with millions of people already living, building, and believing. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain. He landed not on the mainland, but in the islands of the Caribbean. Still, his voyage marked the beginning of centuries of exploration and colonization by European empires. Spain came first, followed by France, the Netherlands, and eventually England. The Spanish settled in the south and west, founding cities in what is now Florida, Texas, New Mexico, and California. They built missions and forts, bringing Christianity, new crops, and new animals, but also disease, forced labor, and conquest. The French moved into the interior, along the Mississippi River, and into Canada. Their settlements were fewer, but they traded deeply with native peoples, especially in fur. They lived in forests and riverside posts, forming alliances and sometimes rivalries with the many nations already there. The Dutch tried to build a colony called New Netherland, planting their roots at the mouth of a wide river they named after their captain, Henry Hudson. The English would later take it and rename it New York. But it was England's colonies that would grow the most. In 1607, a group of settlers founded Jamestown, Virginia. It was not easy. They arrived unprepared. Hunger, disease, and conflict nearly wiped them out. Yet they endured, helped at times by native tribes, and eventually planted the crop that would shape much of early America: tobacco. 13 years later, in 1620, a different kind of group arrived, not fortune seekers, but families fleeing religious persecution. They called themselves Pilgrims and founded a colony in Massachusetts. More followed: Puritans, Quakers, Catholics, and others. They sought land, freedom, and a fresh start, building towns, schools, and churches. But as the colonies grew, they pushed into native lands, often without consent, often with force. Treaties were made and broken. Some native nations resisted, others tried to adapt. Many were devastated by disease brought from Europe, illnesses like smallpox that swept through entire communities who had never encountered them before. By the early 1700s, 13 English colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, from Georgia in the south to Massachusetts in the north. Each had its own character, laws, and economy. Yet they all lived under the distant rule of the British Crown. To the west, across the Appalachian Mountains, native nations still held vast lands. The continent was large, the future was uncertain, and the pressures of expansion, identity, and power were beginning to rise. For now, the colonies were British, but they were also something else, something in between. A new identity was quietly forming, shaped by distance, diversity, and the idea that maybe they didn't need kings at all. By the middle of the 1700s, life in the 13 British colonies had become rich with contradiction. Farmers, merchants, tradespeople, and scholars were building new lives in towns and villages across the eastern seaboard. They spoke English, observed British law, and considered themselves loyal subjects of the Crown. But across the ocean, that Crown had little understanding of what colonial life truly looked like. The colonies were growing. Trade was booming. The population had reached over 2 million, and the land still seemed endless. People were moving westward, inching toward the mountains. With each passing year, the colonies felt more self-sufficient and less dependent on a king they had never seen. In 1754, a war broke out that would shift everything, the French and Indian War. It was part of a larger conflict between Britain and France, but here in North America, it played out as a struggle for territory. British troops and colonial militias fought alongside each other, facing French forces and their native allies. It lasted 7 years, and though Britain emerged victorious, the cost of war was enormous. To pay off its debts, the British government began to tax the colonies, not gradually but directly. New laws were passed in London, and they affected daily life in Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. For many colonists, it felt like a slow tightening, rules made from far away without their consent. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. It wasn't just about money, it was about voice, about autonomy, about the sense that a people who built their own towns and fought their own wars deserved a say in their own future. Tensions rose. In Boston, protests turned into chaos. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd during a confrontation, an event that would be called the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed. The memory lingered. Then, in 1773, colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped entire chests of tea into the sea. It was a bold act of defiance, the Boston Tea Party, and Britain responded with harsh punishments. Meetings were held, pamphlets were printed, voices like Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, and John Adams began to rise. Colonies sent delegates to gather in Philadelphia, and in 1775 in the towns of Lexington and Concord, the first shots were fired. The revolution had begun. The fighting was uneven from the start. Britain had one of the strongest armies in the world. The colonists had militias, local farmers and blacksmiths who trained on village greens. But they had something else too, a growing belief that they could choose their own fate. On July 4, 1776, they made it official. Representatives from the 13 colonies approved the Declaration of Independence, a document that spoke not just to kings, but to the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The war would last 8 years. It would test every assumption and strain every alliance. But in the end, the colonies would win, not just independence, but identity. A new nation had been born. And yet, as the guns fell silent and the treaties were signed, another question began to rise. What kind of country would this be? When the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, the colonies were no longer colonies. They were states, 13 of them, and together they had won their independence. But victory brought new challenges. They had broken away from a monarchy. Now they had to decide how to govern themselves. At first, the states were held together by a loose agreement called the Articles of Confederation. It gave each state a great deal of power and left the central government weak. Too weak, it turned out. Congress could not raise taxes, regulate trade, or even enforce its own laws. Each state printed its own money. Disagreements grew. The country was free but fragile. So in 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to try again. In a hot, closed room behind shuttered windows, they debated and argued. What they created was the U.S. Constitution, a document that balanced power between states and a federal government. It created a system of checks and balances with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. The Constitution wasn't perfect. It didn't end slavery. It didn't guarantee rights to everyone. But it laid the foundation, and soon after, 10 amendments were added, the Bill of Rights, protecting freedom of speech, religion, and the press. It promised citizens that they would be heard and that government would be limited. In 1789, George Washington became the first president. He had led the Continental Army during the war, and now he would lead the new republic. He didn't want to be a king. He served 2 terms, then stepped down, setting a peaceful example for every president after him. During those early years, the country grew quickly. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia became busy centers of trade and ideas. Farmers tilled new lands. The first political parties formed. Leaders like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson clashed over how powerful the federal government should be. But the contradictions of this new nation ran deep. Freedom had been declared, yet millions of people remained enslaved. The economy, especially in the South, was built on forced labor, and Native American nations who had never surrendered their lands were pushed further west by settlers claiming territory as their own. Still, the United States moved forward. New states were added, roads were built, canals connected distant regions, and a sense of identity began to form, not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans. In the year 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a bold move. He purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, a vast stretch of land that doubled the size of the country. It opened the door to Western expansion, and with it, new questions. How would this land be governed? Would slavery expand with it? What would happen to the native nations who already lived there? To explore the new land, Jefferson sent 2 men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, on a journey to the Pacific. Guided in part by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, they mapped rivers, met with tribes, and marveled at the vastness of the continent. The young republic was changing. Fast, it was still vulnerable, still full of tension, but it was growing, and every road it built, every law it passed, every step westward added a new thread to its unfinished tapestry. By the 1860s, the United States had grown into a vast and divided country. There were 33 states, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the nation was not united in spirit. At the center of its deepest conflict stood the issue of slavery. In the North, many states had outlawed slavery, and industrial cities were rising, full of factories, railroads, and growing immigrant communities. In the South, plantations still relied on the forced labors of millions of enslaved people. Cotton was king. The economy depended on it, but that economy came at a terrible human cost. As new states joined the Union, a fierce debate emerged. Would they allow slavery or not? Each new decision felt like a tipping point. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He opposed the expansion of slavery but promised not to interfere with it where it already existed. Still, many in the South saw his election as a threat. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union. They formed their own government, the Confederate States of America. And in April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. It would last 4 years. It would become the deadliest conflict in American history, and it would change the country forever. The North had more people, more factories, more railroads. The South had strong military leaders, knowledge of the terrain, and fierce resolve. The war was brutal. It was fought in fields, in forests, in cities, and along rivers. At Antietam, more than 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day. At Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, over 50,000 men fell. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in the rebelling states were free. It didn't end slavery everywhere, but it gave the war a new moral purpose, the fight for human freedom. That same year, at the battlefield of Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a short speech, just a few minutes long, that became one of the most famous in American history. He spoke of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and of a new birth of freedom. Slowly, the tide turned. Union forces, led by generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, gained ground. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. Just days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by an assassin while attending a play in Washington, D.C. The country mourned a president who had held it together through its darkest hour. Slavery was formally abolished with the 13th Amendment. The 14th and 15th Amendments followed, granting citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved men. For a moment, the nation seemed ready to rebuild on a new foundation. But Reconstruction was not simple. The South resisted change. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and fear to maintain control. Laws were passed to limit the rights of Black Americans. What had been won in war would now have to be defended in peace. And yet, amid the hardship, progress continued. Schools were founded. Black communities grew. New voices began to rise. Voices that would echo across generations, calling for justice, dignity, and equality. The Civil War had ended slavery, but the struggle for freedom was far from over. The long night had passed, but morning would take time to arrive. After the Civil War, the United States stepped into a new era, one of rebuilding, invention, and expansion. From the 1870s to the early 1900s, this period came to be known as the Gilded Age. The phrase, popularized by writer Mark Twain, suggested something glittering on the surface, but flawed underneath. On the outside, the country seemed to shine. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, factories lit up the skyline, immigrants arrived by the millions, filling neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, Boston, and beyond. New inventions, like the telephone, the light bulb, and the typewriter, changed the rhythm of daily life. Cities grew taller, steel replaced wood, money flowed like never before. This was the age of tycoons, men like Andrew Carnegie and Steele, John D. Rockefeller in oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, and J.P. Morgan in finance built fortunes so vast that they reshaped the economy. Some called them captains of industry, others called them robber barons. Their wealth was staggering, but it wasn't shared evenly. While the rich built mansions and opera houses, factory workers lived in crowded tenements, working long hours in dangerous conditions for low pay. Children worked in coal mines, families struggled to afford bread, even as industrial empires soared. Labor unions began to form, demanding better wages and safer workplaces. Strikes swept the country, some peaceful, others not. In Chicago, the Haymarket Affair of 1886 ended in chaos and violence after a bomb exploded at a workers' rally. In Homestead and Pullman, clashes between workers and authorities turned deadly. The fight for labor rights was slow, painful, and far from over. At the same time, millions of immigrants poured into the United States, many from Southern and Eastern Europe. They came with little, hoping for freedom, work, and a new beginning. At Ellis Island, they were inspected, questioned, and often overwhelmed. Some were turned away. Most were allowed in, stepping onto crowded streets with heavy accents and hopeful hearts. On the West Coast, Chinese immigrants faced a different challenge. After years of helping build the Transcontinental Railroad, they were met with rising hostility. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became the first major federal law to restrict immigration based on nationality. It reflected a growing wave of xenophobia, a fear of the other, that would shape future policies. Meanwhile, America's push westward continued. Settlers claimed land under the Homestead Act. Cowboys drove cattle across open plains. But the price of expansion was steep. Native American nations, already pushed back by decades of war and broken treaties, faced continued displacement. One of the final and most tragic chapters came in 1890 at Wounded Knee, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children. The massacre marked the end of armed native resistance in the West. It also marked a deep wound, one that has never fully healed. Even so, native communities endured. Their cultures, languages, and stories survived, often quietly, often in defiance, but always alive. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had become an industrial giant. It had millions of workers, a growing middle class, and influence that reached beyond its borders. But it was also a country full of contradictions, between wealth and poverty, opportunity and oppression, growth and injustice. The glittering lights of the Gilded Age masked many shadows, and those shadows would soon demand to be seen. As the 20th century began, the United States was brimming with energy. Cities were crowded and humming. Immigrants were arriving by the thousands. New inventions seemed to appear every year. The telephone, the electric light, and the automobile transformed the way people lived, but not everyone shared in the progress. With great industry came great inequality. Wealthy families built enormous estates, while factory workers struggled to afford rent and food. Children toiled in mills and mines. Urban neighborhoods grew more crowded and unsafe. In response, a wave of reformers rose up, journalists, activists, and everyday citizens who believed the country could do better. This became the Progressive Era. Progressives wanted to clean up politics, protect workers, and give people a greater voice in government. Investigative journalists, known as muckrakers, exposed corruption and injustice. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, revealing the gruesome realities of the meat-packing industry. The public was horrified. Soon, the government passed laws to improve food safety. Others fought for women's suffrage, public education, and environmental protection. One of the most influential leaders of this time was President Theodore Roosevelt. He believed the government had a duty to act in the public interest. He took on powerful monopolies, strengthened consumer protections, and helped establish the national park system to preserve the country's natural beauty. Meanwhile, women continued their long fight for the right to vote. For decades, leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul organized marches, rallies, and petitions. Finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women across the country could now vote, a moment that had taken generations to achieve. In the midst of these changes, the United States found itself drawn into global affairs. In 1917, the country entered World War I, joining allies in Europe in a massive, destructive conflict. Millions of soldiers served and thousands gave their lives. The war ended in 1918, but its impact lingered. Many returned home changed by loss, by injury, and by the realization that the world was no longer as simple as it seemed. Back at home, the 1920s brought a wave of transformation. It was an era of jazz music, flapper dresses, speakeasies, and motion pictures. Radios became common in homes, dance halls filled with the sounds of swing, and cities like New York and Chicago grew ever taller. Yet beneath the glamour, tensions simmered. Racial violence continued. In 1921, the prosperous black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, often called Black Wall Street, was attacked and burned to the ground by a white mob. Hundreds were killed, thousands lost their homes. Events like these revealed how far the country still had to go. Prohibition, which banned the sale of alcohol, led to a rise in organized crime. And then, in 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks failed, jobs disappeared, families lost everything. The Great Depression had begun. It was the deepest economic crisis in American history. People lined up for bread. Dust storms swept across the plains. Children went hungry. And still, communities did what they could to help one another, sharing food, shelter, and hope. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. With calm and confidence, he introduced the New Deal, a series of programs meant to revive the economy, support the unemployed, and restore trust in the system. Social security was created, roads, bridges, and schools were built. Art and music programs gave work to creators. The country slowly began to recover. Through all of it, the American people endured. They folded laundry by lamplight. They listened to the radio together in silence. They planted gardens in empty lots. Even when the future was uncertain, they kept going, quietly, bravely, and with a deep belief that better days might still come. And just as things began to stabilize, another storm was forming. A storm far across the ocean, one that would soon sweep across the world. The year was 1941. The United States was still feeling the weight of the Great Depression, but signs of recovery had begun to appear. Then, one December morning, the world changed. On December 7th, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Battleships burned. More than 2,400 Americans lost their lives. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, on Germany and Italy. The country had entered World War II. What followed was a national effort unlike anything seen before. Factories that once made cars now made tanks and planes. Millions of men joined the armed forces. Women filled the jobs they left behind, building ships, driving trucks, managing assembly lines. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength and determination. Families rationed food, children collected scrap metal. The entire nation seemed to move with a shared purpose. American troops fought across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They stormed beaches, crossed frozen forests, and marched through ruined cities. They faced unimaginable danger. Many never returned home. Back in the United States, not all was fair. More than 100,000 Japanese Americans, many of them citizens, were forced into internment camps simply because of their ancestry. Their homes, businesses, and freedoms were taken. It remains a dark chapter in the story of a country fighting for liberty abroad while denying it to some at home. By 1945, the war was nearing its end. In Europe, Allied forces pushed into Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, the fighting was fierce. Then, in August, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond anything the world had ever seen. Days later, Japan surrendered. World War II had ended. It had taken the lives of more than 400,000 Americans and millions more around the globe. But it also marked the beginning of a new era. The United States emerged from the war as a global superpower. Its cities were intact, its industries were booming, soldiers returned home to new opportunities. The GI Bill helped veterans attend college and buy homes. Suburbs began to spread. A generation of families planted their roots and dreamed of something steady, something better. Televisions appeared in living rooms. Children played in cul-de-sacs. The 1950s were marked by optimism, but also by unease. The Cold War had begun. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union, once an ally, became a rival. The world was now divided by ideology, democracy and capitalism on one side, communism on the other. Tensions rose. Both countries built nuclear weapons. The possibility of total destruction hung silently in the air. At home, fear crept in. Americans built fallout shelters. School children practiced drills, ducking beneath their desks in case of an atomic attack. The Red Scare took hold. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused people of being communists, often with no real proof. Lives and careers were ruined. And yet, even in this climate of fear, progress was unfolding. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It was a groundbreaking decision, one that would help spark the modern civil rights movement. That same year, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her quiet act of resistance ignited a wave of protest and gave rise to a young pastor named Martin Luther King, Jr. A new fight for justice had begun. The country was changing, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in shouts, but change had begun, and the people were finding their voice. The 1960s arrived like a wave, loud in some places, hopeful in others, and full of momentum. It was a decade shaped by protest, music, invention, and grief. People were speaking out, reaching higher, and asking more of their country. At the heart of it all was the civil rights movement. Across the South, brave men and women stood up against injustice. They sat at lunch counters, marched across bridges, and rode buses into towns that didn't welcome them. They faced threats, jail, and violence. Still they kept going. In 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his most famous speech. He spoke of dreams, not just for himself, but for the nation. A dream where people would be judged by character, not color. Where freedom would ring from every hill. That same year, President John F. Kennedy called for civil rights legislation. But just months later, he was assassinated in Dallas. The country was stunned. People wept openly in the streets. Yet even in mourning, the work continued. Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president after Kennedy's death, signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. A year later, the Voting Rights Act followed. These laws outlawed discrimination and ensured that all citizens could vote, especially in places where Black Americans had been denied that right for generations. Meanwhile, the United States was getting pulled deeper into conflict overseas. In Vietnam, a long, complex war was unfolding. What had begun as a mission to stop the spread of communism grew into a prolonged and painful conflict. American troops faced jungles, ambushes, and growing opposition back home. Television brought the war into living rooms. Each night, families saw images of fire and loss. Many began to ask why the war was being fought. Protesters gathered on college campuses. Some burned their draft cards. Others marched through city streets calling for peace. And yet, in the midst of struggle, there were moments of wonder. In 1969, millions watched in awe as astronauts walked on the moon. Neil Armstrong's quiet voice echoed through space. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For a moment, the world held its breath together. But even that triumph couldn't soften the sorrow of the times. In 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was also killed while campaigning for president. It felt as though every time hope rose, it was cut short. Still, change was moving. Women demanded equal rights and opportunities in the workplace, in politics, and in education. The feminist movement gained strength. In 1972, Title IX was passed, ensuring that schools and colleges receiving public funds could not discriminate based on gender. New voices rose in the LGBTQ+ community as well. In 1969, after a police raid at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, people fought back. The moment sparked a movement, one that would grow in strength and visibility over the decades that followed. In the 1970s, the environment became a national concern. After years of pollution and neglect, the first Earth Day was held in 1970. That same year, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, aiming to protect air, water, and natural spaces for generations to come. But even as people pushed for progress, trust in government was shaken. A break-in at the Watergate complex led to an investigation that uncovered a web of lies and abuses of power. In 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned, the first and only U.S. president to do so. The nation had been tested again. not by war or protest, but by its own institutions. And yet the system held, the Constitution endured, power changed hands peacefully. By the end of the 1970s, America had become something new, more diverse, more complex, still deeply divided in some places, but also more open to voices that had long been silenced. The country was still young, still learning, and the next decade would bring even more change, driven by new technology, new challenges, and a renewed search for purpose. The 1980s began with a sense of fatigue. Inflation was high, jobs were uncertain, and Americans were searching for confidence again. In 1980, they elected Ronald Reagan, a former actor and governor of California, who promised a return to strength, optimism, and simplicity. He called it Morning Again in America. Reagan believed in smaller government, lower taxes, and a strong military. His economic plan, later called Reaganomics, focused on tax cuts and reducing regulations. Supporters said it revived the economy. Critics pointed out that it also widened the gap between the rich and poor. Technology was beginning to reshape daily life. Personal computers entered homes and offices, cable television, video games, and microwave ovens became common. Music was no longer just on the radio, it was on MTV. A cultural shift was underway, and the pace of change was quickening, but not everything was upbeat. The Cold War with the Soviet Union had entered a tense phase. Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and both nations increased their nuclear arsenals. People feared what might happen if the standoff ever turned into open conflict. And yet something began to change. In the Soviet Union, a new leader named Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms. His policies of glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, signaled a new direction. The dialogue between the two superpowers grew more hopeful. In 1987, Reagan visited Berlin and gave a now famous speech, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years later, in 1989, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of division between East and West, came crashing down. People danced in the streets. The Cold War was drawing to a close. While global tensions eased, challenges at home remained. A mysterious and deadly virus was spreading, HIV. At first, little was understood. The disease disproportionately affected gay men and was met with silence and stigma. But as the crisis grew, so did the response. Activists demanded attention, compassion, and medical research. The movement gave rise to new communities of care and resistance, even amid sorrow and loss. In 1989, George H.W. Bush became president. That same year, the world watched as the Soviet Union began to dissolve. By 1991, the Cold War was officially over. The United States stood alone as the world's most powerful nation, but with new responsibilities and new uncertainties. At home, the 1990s brought rapid change. Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992. Under his leadership, the economy grew, the internet expanded, and the world became more connected. Trade deals opened markets, technology companies soared, a sense of modern progress filled the air. But not everything was smooth. The 1990s saw growing debates over healthcare, welfare, and crime. Political battles deepened, and in 1998, Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives over a personal scandal. He was acquitted by the Senate and remained in office, But the moment marked a shift. Politics had become more personal, more divisive. Still, the country was at peace. The economy was strong, and for many it felt like a golden moment, full of promise, comfort, and the thrill of a new digital age. No one could know that the new century would begin with a shattering moment, that an ordinary September morning would soon divide history into before and after. The 21st century began with quiet optimism. The Cold War was over. The economy was strong. Technology was connecting people in ways no one had imagined just a few years before. And then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. It began like any other day. Then 4 planes were hijacked by terrorists. 2 crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. A 3rd hit the Pentagon. The 4th was brought down by passengers in a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. The images were burned into memory. Smoke rising, buildings collapsing, first responders running toward danger. The country was shaken, stunned and grieving, but it was also united. People lined up to donate blood. They lit candles. They checked on neighbors. And within days, the government launched what became known as the War on Terror. The US invaded Afghanistan, where the terrorist group responsible for the attacks, Al-Qaeda, had found shelter. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, citing fears of weapons of mass destruction. The wars were long, costly, and complicated. Soldiers deployed again and again. Thousands lost their lives. Many returned home carrying wounds, both visible and hidden. At home, security changed. Airports added checkpoints. Government agencies expanded surveillance. Fear and patriotism walked side by side. Some Americans, especially Muslims and people of Middle Eastern descent, faced suspicion and discrimination. The balance between safety and freedom became one of the defining tensions of the time. In 2008, another historic moment arrived. Barack Obama was elected president, the first black president in American history. His campaign message, "Yes, we can," inspired millions. He inherited an economy in crisis, facing the most severe recession since the Great Depression. Banks were failing, homes were being lost, unemployment soared. But through stimulus programs and long recovery efforts, the economy slowly began to stabilize. During Obama's presidency, healthcare reform was passed, a major goal for many decades. The Affordable Care Act expanded access to insurance for millions of Americans, though debates around it remained heated. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples had the right to marry across all 50 states, a landmark victory for LGBTQ+ rights. Social progress continued to grow, but so did political division. In 2016, the country took another sharp turn. Donald Trump, a businessman and reality TV host with no political experience, was elected president. His rise reflected deep frustration in parts of the country with globalization, immigration, and the political system itself. His presidency was marked by strong rhetoric, fierce opposition, and constant debate. Supporters admired his directness. Critics worried about democratic norms and deepening divides. And then, in 2020, the world changed again, this time because of a virus. COVID-19 swept across the globe, shutting down cities, closing schools, and overwhelming hospitals. More than 1 million lives were lost in the US alone. People stayed indoors, streets went quiet. Frontline workers carried the weight of an invisible enemy. Yet even in isolation, people found connection. They held virtual birthdays. They sang from balconies. Scientists around the world worked together to create vaccines in record time. It was a moment of global unity, wrapped in uncertainty. That same year, the killing of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, by a police officer in Minneapolis sparked one of the largest protest movements in American history. Millions of people marched not only across the United States, but across the world, calling for justice, accountability, and change. In November, Joe Biden was elected president. Kamala Harris became vice president, the first woman, the first black American, and the first person of South Asian descent to hold the office. Another barrier had been broken. Another chapter had begun. As the country faced a new decade, it stood at a crossroads, shaped by past struggles, but also filled with new voices, new ideas, and a renewed desire to become the nation it had always promised to be. And so we arrive at the present, not at the end of the story, but at a turning page. The United States today is vast, diverse, and in constant motion. Its cities glow at night, its landscapes stretch from deserts to coastlines, its people speak hundreds of languages, carry many histories, and hold hopes that sometimes align and sometimes clash. The country continues to wrestle with old questions. What does freedom really mean? Who gets to share in it? How can a nation built on both ideals and injustice truly live up to its promises? There are no easy answers. And perhaps that's what makes the story of America both complex and quietly beautiful. It isn't a finished painting hanging still in a frame. It's a living, breathing tapestry, woven from both strength and softness, from moments of greatness and moments of deep reflection. The United States has led revolutions in science, medicine, and technology. It has given the world inventions, music, ideas, and movements. It has also made grave mistakes in how it has treated its land, its people, and its power. And yet, generation after generation, people have stepped forward to push the story forward, to question, to protest, to serve, to care. Today's America includes voices that were once silenced. It includes families from every corner of the world. It includes stories of resilience, innovation, and quiet courage. And while disagreement is common, so too is the shared desire to build something lasting, something better. No one knows what the next chapter will bring, but one thing is certain. It will be written by the choices we make each day, in how we treat each other, in how we listen, and in how we dream. So now, as you settle beneath the quiet weight of this long and winding story, remember, you are part of it too, in the way you think, in the kindness you offer, in the dreams you carry into tomorrow. This isn't only the story of a nation, it's the story of people, of hearts and hands, just like yours. Rest well now, dear soul, and thank you for letting me keep you company tonight.